The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 32. Evening, Indoors and Out. The 2 miles and a half long procession was not the only popular demonstration which made the coronation of George IV memorable in the annals of Manchester. There were no telegraph wires to flash intelligence to the supporters of Queen Caroline that she had been repulsed from the Abbey gates and driven thence to die broken-hearted and uncrowned. So, in the absence of a cause for indignation, loyalty, or its substitute, contrived to add a pendant of disorder and excess, only to be recorded as the dung-heap out of which grew flowers of promise. As in most of the private houses along the line of route, a cold collation had been prepared for the refreshment of the friends who crowded Mr. Ashton's open windows, but no calculation had been made of the space the unwonted pageant would cover, or the time it would occupy in passing, and Mrs. Ashton, having discovered that sightseeing in the dust and glare of July was parching and fatiguing, issued orders for tea to be handed round when the last banner had disappeared, and before her less intimate friends should rise to depart. In giving these orders, she unwittingly stirred the kitchen fire into a white heat. Lavish hospitality was a characteristic of the time, and when a family of good position professed to keep open house, it was generally equal to the most extravagant demands. As a rule, Mrs. Ashton had little leaning towards impromptu parties, and Kezia considerably less, preferring those grand and formal receptions which involved elaborate preparation and placed imaginary feathers in the caps of mistress and maids. Kezia herself considered the honour of the house involved in everything under her control being in apple pie order, and the surprise which put her on her mettle put her also in a fume. Recalled from the window whence her head had been poked far as the farthest to provide tea and its concomitants for an indefinite number of strangers, she accompanied her erratic movements about her domain with explosive outbursts of spleen at being taken unawares when nowt's ready to hand. Here's Missus been and ordered tea for all boiling of folk upstairs, and there's Cicely and t'other wenches, all agog o' th' crownation, and not worth toss of a pancake. She jerked out her anger in the ears of Bess Hume, who, seated on the settle, had just lulled to sleep Mrs. Walmsley's crying baby, which, neglected by its gaping nurse, had commemorated the day by a fall from a high bed. Bess made a temporary couch for the baby in a snug corner, and quietly came to Kezia's assistance. Then Ellen Chadwick, intuitively perceptive of kitchen troubles, busied herself in bringing reserves of china, glass, plate, linen, and sweetmeats from closets and storeroom. Cicely and Dolly came down in due time, and the credit of the establishment lost nothing in Kezia's hands, even though there was an additional influx of visitors, and a supper also to provide. That was Mr. Ashton's affair. He had tired of his processional march in the broiling sun by the time they'd skirted Hardwick and defiled into Chancery Lane. The 2 friends by his side, Mr. John McConnell and Mr. John Green, both cotton spinners, with whom he dealt, being of the same mind, they had also fallen out of the line in Ancoats Lane, and turned down Canal Street to the house of the latter, to refresh themselves with something less dry than snuff or road dust. Mr. Green was the uncle of Henry Liversedge, the artist, fragile of form and spiritual of face, but the latter was then only a genius in his 19th year, with fame and an early grave dimly foreshadowed. They found him on the doorstep with his fussy and fidgety, though kind-hearted aunt, just back from Mr. Gore's in Piccadilly, whence they had seen the show. The gentleman's requirement, a draught of ale, was soon supplied, accompanied by a spasmodic comment on the grand display, and the exhibition of a pair of the loyally inscribed fillets she had secured as the small ware weavers passed. "By the by, that was a wonderfully effective banner of yours, Mr. Ashton," interposed the thin voice of Liversedge. "Who painted it?" "A young fellow in my employ who occasionally designs for us," answered Mr. Ashton, handing his snuff-box to the group in rotation. "Quite a self-taught artist." "Indeed, it was not much like an amateur's brush." "I should like to know him. You see, I do something in that way myself." The young painter, conscious of his own latent power, was sensitively alive to undeveloped art in others. "Would you? Just so. Then you shall. Come along, all of you, and finish the day with us. Mrs. Ashton will find us a dish of tea, and I am sure Mrs. Green, she will be proud to see you also." Turning to the gentlemen, who had by this time emptied their tall boy glasses, he added, "And I think I have a few bottles of rare old port waiting among the cobwebs for us to drink the King's health." It was a period of much pressing and many excuses, but the excitement of the day had so far destroyed ceremony that even Mrs. Green, who was somewhat punctilious, after a little nervous trepidation anent the fitness of her last new cap for company, consented and accepted the arm Mr. Ashton gallantly offered to pilot her across the crowded street, along which the tail of the procession had only just trailed. Graciously, though with her natural stateliness, Mrs. Ashton received the newcomers. Mrs. Green, finding the company generally in morning visiting dress, was at ease about her cap. The tea was exhilarating, the viands toothsome, the wines excellent. There was one common topic for discussion. The ice of ceremony had thawed hours before, and genial Mr. Ashton, having locked the doors to prevent the escape of a guest before the supper he had bespoken was demolished, was thoroughly in his element. Mrs. Ashton was not quite so much at ease, though she was too well bred to manifest her disquiet, which had two sources. In the first place, the presumptuous salutation of Augusta by Lieutenant Aspinall had jarred a sensitive nerve. In the second, Mr. Ashton, generally impulsive, had introduced Mr. Clegg to their friends, and as a friend of whom he was himself proud. She thoroughly appreciated Jabez, and equally contemplated his advancement, but she was for making no more haste than good speed, and considered it more prudent to raise him by insensible degrees. And as she watched her husband, radiant with goodwill, cross the room with Jabez, discomposed at the very doorway by the wandering eyes of Augusta, and present him to Mr. Green and Mr. Liversidge, thus ran her thoughts: "Dear me, William is very inconsiderate. He will turn the young man's head and insult our visitors at the same time. I hope Mrs. Clough will not recognise him. How indignant she would be if she thought we expected her to associate with one who once wore her son's cast-off clothes. Certainly he is well conducted and worthy in all respects, but people don't forget such things. If Mr. Green and Mr. McConnell only knew William was introducing our blue-coat apprentice, what would they say? I am glad, however, to see young Mr. Liversidge so affable with Jabez." To her surprise at this juncture, Mr. McConnell drew his chair close to Jabez and Mr. Liversidge, and, attributing the evident embarrassment of the former to the newness of his position, endeavoured to dissipate it by taking part in the conversation, to which quiet Mr. Green occasionally added a word. The lady, who was so afraid of touching the dignity of her friends, had not heard her less exclusive lord whisper to the two cotton spinners, "I'm afraid I've committed a grave misdemeanour in Mrs. Ashton's sight by bringing young Clegg among our party, but kings are not crowned every day, and I thought it a good opportunity to bring a worthy lad out. You," and he tapped his snuff-box, "know what Manchester men are made of, and that young fellow has good stuff in him. He was made to rise, sirs." Mr. Ashton's friends nodded in acquiescence, and, willing to humour their kindly host, and perhaps desirous to test the calibre of an aspirant so introduced, wittingly or unwittingly, did their part in helping him to rise by the very distinction of their prolonged attention. It was an act quite in the way of John McConnell, who had already given a lift to his rising young countryman, Fairbairn, the engineer. Presently Mr. Chadwick, beckoning attentive Ellen to his side, and using her shoulder as a support, involuntarily seconded his brother-in-law by joining the group, and, putting out his hand to Jabez, who rose at his approach, and offered his own seat to the paralytic gentleman, said, "What interests you so much, Mr. Clegg?" that you forget old friends?" "No, sir, I had not forgotten you, nor Miss Chadwick either." Ellen coloured. "But Mr. Ashton having honoured me with an introduction to Mr. Liversidge and these gentlemen," bowing to them, "I was not at liberty to break away, had I felt so disposed." "We were discussing the influence of art on our local manufactures," added Henry Liversidge, and thereupon the subject was resumed. Ellen, necessarily in close attendance on her father, standing there with sparkling black eyes, an animated and attentive listener, well pleased that Mr. Clegg's merits, as seen by her, had at length found recognition. Meanwhile, Augusta, the centre of a group of young people, indulged in sentimental chit-chat, and, trifling with her fan and human hearts, completed the enslavement of her last admirer, a fair-haired Mr. Marsland, while Jabez, from his distant seat, looked and longed in vain. Cards were, as a matter of course, proposed for the amusement of this extemporised party, and, in filling up tables for whist or loo, Mrs. Ashton's fears for the sensibility of her friends were forgotten. They were utterly put to the rout by a loud rat-tat-tat at the street door, followed by the entrance of Mr. Clough and the Reverend Joshua Brooks, the latter less vigorous than of yore, but in a state of unusual excitement. His loud voice was heard before he was seen. "Hogs, sir, hogs! They are no better than hogs, sir," he was saying, even as he came into the drawing-room. He appeared too much ruffled to respond composedly to the kindly greetings of his many friends. Even Augusta, who put forth her little white hand with her most winning smile, attracted no more attention than a hurried, "How d'ye do, lass, how d'ye do?" "What is the matter, Mr. Brooks, you seem—" he interrupted Mr. Ashton's inquiry with, "Matter, sir? Waste and riot, intemperance and indecency are the matter. These old eyes have seen that which is enough to bring a curse upon the coronation, and a blight upon the town." Conversation was arrested, flirtation forgot its part, cards were laid down, save by 3 or 4 inveterate players, and young and old were alike on the qui-vive, crowding round the speaker. "Permit me," said Mr. Clough, commencing an explanation. "I suppose you are all aware that the new market in Shudehill is the chief station of the 9 appointed for the distribution of meat, bread, and ale to the populace." "Populace, indeed! The very scum and dregs of the town! Say rather the lowest, roughest rabble!" broke in old Joshua. "Well, parson, for the credit of our working population, let us hope so," chimed in Mr. Clough, resuming. "Whilst Mr. Brooks and I were at tea in his sanctum, Tabitha ran in breathless to tell us that the platform erected for recipients in front of the storehouse had given way, that several persons were injured, and one had been killed on the spot." "Ah," said the parson, drawing a long breath between his teeth, while Jabez, unobserved by either, drew near to listen, and the ladies put up their hands in horror. "It was not our most direct route, but either curiosity or compassion took us round by Shudehill Market on our road hither, and never shall I forget the scene we witnessed. Loaves and hunks of meat were being pitched high and far amongst the crowd, from the warehouse doors and windows, as if flung to hounds." "Hounds, sir?" burst in impatient Joshua. "Don't slander the better animal. Only the commonest curs would have yelped and scrambled and struggled and fought for their rations, as did the human beasts we saw, clutching and gripping from weaker women and children that which had fallen within their reach, or trampling in the mud underfoot the food they were too greedy or too drunk to devour. Aye, mud, for their very kennels ran with ale thrown in pitchers full amongst the people, to be caught in hats and bonnets and hollowed hands, as if it were rain in an African desert. Ale, the atmosphere reeked of ale. Men, women, and children of all ages carried it away, or drank it from all sorts of vessels, reeled, hiccuped, and staggered under their burden, or sank down by the wayside, whilst others, shouting like maniacs, drained the half-empty mugs. I tell you, sirs, Captain Coote never fell in with greater savages, even death and disaster in their midst had not awed them. Ugh! I say again, they are hogs, absolute hogs." As Joshua paused to take breath and sank into a chair, Jabez modestly put the question to the excitable chaplain. "Do you not think the distributors are most to blame for this wanton waste and excess, to say nothing of the loss of life? Surely the arrangements of the committee must have been defective." The parson's harsh tones softened as he put out his hand to grasp the speaker's. "Aye, Jabez, lad, is that thee? I'm glad to see thee here," and he laid emphasis on the word. "Aye, the distributors are answerable for—" But the personal recognition had created a diversion. The question Jabez had mooted was talked over by separate knots of individuals in different quarters of the large room, whilst Mr. Clough, to Mrs. Ashton's amazement, yes, and gratification also, shook the salesman warmly by the hand and congratulated him on his apparent success. Moreover, he bore him away to Mrs. Clough at the loo table, and called her attention to the change time had effected in the old tanner's foster child in the most cordial manner. Thanks to Mr. Ashton, Mr. Clegg had truly got his first foot into Manchester society that coronation day, and his old hopes might have revived had not a disturbing element crept into the room during the denunciatory oration of his clerical friend. John Walmsley, not finding his wife at home when released from yeomanry duty, had come in quest of her, bringing two of his comrades, and when Mr. Clegg retired from the loo table with a bow, his eyes fell first on the conspicuous figure of Captain Travis, in the silver and blue glory of uniform, bending deferentially to address Miss Chadwick, and in another moment on the elegant Adonis he had dragged from icy death, toying with Miss Augusta's carved ivory fan, and whispering low to her, while she hid her Indian muslin robe and too eloquent face behind the screen of her convenient harp, and drew her flexible fingers lightly across the chords. The lustre of that evening's introduction was dim for Jabez. Augusta scarcely looked at him as she brushed past to supper, leaning on the arm of Lieutenant Aspinall, her white dress in strong contrast to his dark uniform, and no doubt his pain was pictured on his face, for Ellen Chadwick sighed as she too passed him with her martial cavalier, and half turned to look pitifully as she went. There was no lack of ladies, so Mrs. Ashton paired Mr. Clegg off with a chatty damsel of 30 or thereabouts, and he did his best to listen and make himself agreeable, but not even the novelty of his situation could keep his thoughts or his eyes from wandering where they should not. Along the whole course of the procession, the Manchester yeomanry had been greeted with more hisses and groans than cheers. This had chafed their noble spirits, and on disbanding they had sought consolation in the wine-cup, which temperate Jabez was not slow to observe, although their degree of exhilaration was not then considered a disqualification for the drawing-room or for the society of ladies. Mr. Ashton's strong home-brewed supper ale was not a sedative, yet still Augusta smiled on Lawrence, in spite of her mother's frowns, driving Mr. Marsland to desperation, and Jabez to despair. Indeed, he was glad when the repast was over, for then Joshua Bruce rose to depart, sober as when he sat down, and the Chadwicks also. He had thus an opportunity of escaping from his torment by offering his escort to tottering Mr. Chadwick and the parson in succession, if the latter did not object to the slight detour. Jabez foresaw that Mr. Travis was ready to do Miss Chadwick suit and service, but in offering his arm to assist the slow feet of the disabled father, he little dreamed how gladly the daughter would have made an exchange, nor, had he been wiser, would he have thrust himself in Big Ben's way, any more than would Mrs. Chadwick, who openly favoured the personable and unimpeachable captain. Chapter 33. Clogs. Leaving the Chadwicks at their own door, where Captain Travis would fain have lingered, had he been encouraged, Jabez and he fell back as guards to their reverend friend, whose excitability might otherwise have involved him in some unpleasantness, so disorderly a riff-raff occupied the streets. Turning down Church Street, they pursued their dimly lighted way along Cannon Street, so named from dismounted cannon, said to be captured from rebels, which served as corner posts, through Hanging Ditch to Ice Cross, thence past the deserted apple market and Dr. Smith's ancient labyrinth of a house, to the parson's less antiquated domicile in the corner by the grammar school, and those college gates which had been the portals of peace and promise to Jabez, and not only to him, but to hundreds besides. The excitement of old Joshua had been toned down amongst the wax lights and pleasant faces around the Ashtons' well-spread supper table, and at first he was disposed to be conversable after his own peculiar manner. They had purposely avoided Shoedale Market by an ample circuit, but stragglers of both sexes from the scene of riot lay maundering or asleep in their path, or crossed it at every turn, in all stages of inebriation and disorder, until the natural irritability of the chaplain, increased by failing health, broke forth in loud-voiced indignation, ending in a wail that he was getting old and powerless, or he would rise like another John Knox and denounce the wickedness rampant in the land. "A good man lives there, Jabez," said he, pointing to the black and white home of the headmaster, where lighted windows told of hospitality awake. "A good man, but for whom I should not be alive to tell you. But there are those in the pulpit, my lads, whom the church ought to spew out, lest they poison the flocks it is their duty to feed. Can the stream be pure if the fountain be polluted? And how shall we rebuke the gross excesses of the untaught rabble, whilst chambering, gluttony, and drunkenness defile the high places of the land? Ugh! There wants another flood to wash Europe sweet and clean. The sin on the earth was not greater in the days of Noah." They were crossing the space before the two closed gates, when he paused for lack of breath, and Travis, with no thought but to change the subject, observed to Jabez, over the head of the panting pastor, "How quiet this little nook of ground is now, yet to me, and no doubt to you, Mr. Clegg, it is haunted by ghosts of old times." That set Joshua off again. "Ugh! To hear a lad of 25 talk of old times. What's the world coming to? Ghosts indeed. It had like to have been haunted by ghosts of something more than old times, as Jabez and I know to our cost. I've never been right since the young ruffians had me in their clutches. And mark you, my lads, and think of it when you have young ones of your own to rear, there's no worse sign for a country or a family than when the young jibe and jeer, mock and scorn their elders, when grey hairs fail to command respect, virtue, principle, and religion are at their lowest ebb." He stood within his own gate as he said this, and, as Tabitha opened the door for her master, he checked all reply with, "There, you've had a sermon for nothing. Ugh! You'll forget it when the old man's back turns. Good night, lads. See you steer clear of brawls, and give drunken fools a wide berth." Leaving the young men, so abruptly dismissed, to retrace their steps towards Hyde's Cross, it may be as well if we throw a light on some of Parson Brooke's dark allusions. Time had not smoothed the old man's eccentricities, nor modified the antagonism between the grammar school boys and the ex-master. They were always at war, and there was never wanting a casus belli. The previous September he'd been more than usually irritated by a lampoon which began, "Old Jotty, you dog, your house we all know is headquarters of prog," the purport of which was to fix on him the stigma of inviting a friend to dine, and regaling him with a black pudding only. Lashed to fury, he burst into the grammar school when the first and second form boys were assembled in the afternoon to rehearse the speeches which, according to custom, they were to deliver in public at the annual commemoration in October. He braved them in his hottest style, winding up with, "You are a set of blockheads. I would not come to hear your speeches if you would pay me for it." There was a general cry, "Turn him out, turn him out!" But Jotty would not be turned out. He stuck himself in the doorway with his legs against the doorpost and his back against the door itself, to the extreme risk of broken limbs, whilst his young and vigorous opponents brought their strength to bear upon the door to force him out. With such odds he was sure to be overcome, but driven into the yard he fought with his antagonists like a mastiff at bay, and they, like the cowards they must have been, to have assailed in a body an old man under any provocation, by sheer force of numbers bore him backwards to the wall, and, but for the opportune arrival of Dr. Smith, would have repeated the outrage perpetrated on Jabez Clegg 8 years before. He might well say Dr. Smith had saved his life. Such a fall, whether in high or low water, to so old a man, would have been certain destruction. They broke his heart, I think, if they did not break his limbs, for he never was the same man afterwards. Even old Mrs. Clews used to rally him on his frequent fits of the dumps. Whether Jabez and Ben Travis had, or had not, lost sight of the parson's homily, they were linked arm in arm, the rich yeomanry officer and the unpretending small-ware salesman, just as, nearly 9 years previously, the big raw-boned youth, with a heart large enough to match his frame, had linked his arm in that of the poor blue-coat boy, as a friend and protector, when as yet his admittance into society was undreamed of. Where the four roads met at Hyde's Cross, a staggering Charlie, as the watchmen were called, much as, at this day, they are bobbies, passed them, with his own lantern and staff and his rattle in his belt, proclaiming, "Past 10 o'clock, hiccup, and a fine moonlit neat." The two stood for a moment, then, animated by a desire to ascertain if Joshua Bruce had spoken sooth or, in his spleen, exaggerated, they turned up Shude Hill, all alive with people who were ordinarily at that hour in bed, and made their way to the market. Exaggerate? Joshua Bruce had seen but in part, and painted but in part. Every avenue to the market was a scene of debauchery. Hogarth's print of Gin Lane was feeble beside it. The distribution of food was over, but that of drink continued. The oil lamps of the street, the dying illumination lamps, and the misty moonlight showed a picture of unimaginable grossness, whilst their ears were assailed with foulness which would have shocked a hardened man of the world. How much more these inexperienced young friends? Children, men and women, their clothes torn or disarrayed, lay singly or in groups on the paths or in the gutters, asleep or awake, drunk, sick, helpless, exposed. There was fighting and cursing over the ale yet procurable. There were loaves in the gutters and meat trampled in the mire. Food which, properly distributed, would have gladdened many a poor, hard-working family, too self-respecting to join that clamorous mob. The two young men turned away sick and disgusted. Henry Hunt, in advocating the disuse of excisable liquors, said Jabez thoughtfully, may only have designed to cripple the government, but surely no one could witness scenes like these, whether Whig or Tory, without feeling that some restriction on drink is absolutely necessary for the safety of the state and the comfort of the people. "You are right, Mr. Clegg," responded Travis heartily. "Men of all politics ought to meet on this ground. I shall see how far my little influence goes to check intemperance henceforth. Something must be done, and that promptly. Whatever I can do to second you, you may depend on, though beyond our own warehouse my opportunities are small," said Jabez. "Still, if I can influence one within our walls, that one may act on two outside, and so we may prevail in the end." "Yes," added Travis, "and if this night be not eloquent in its protest against drink, all humanity must be equally debased and brutalized." Some caution had been necessary to cross the market, so as to avoid insult, the captain's bulk and uniform rendering him conspicuous, and his corps being in anything but good odour. They had kept well within the shade of the pillared piazza, which extended along the side to their right, and, stunned by the uproar of brawling and fighting crowds, picked their way between degraded humanity in heaps on the pavement, crushed hats and bonnets, torn caps and shawls, boots and shoes, which had done duty as drinking vessels, sodden meat and bread, and had much ado to avoid splashing through puddles of ale and other abominations. They had emerged into Oak Street, glad to have got tolerably clear of the clamour and brutality, when a cry from the direction of Tib Street, "Watch! Help! Watch!" fell on their ears in tones which had a strangely familiar ring to Jabez. Hastening on at a run, they came upon a decently dressed man struggling against 3 or 4 drunken ruffians with heavy clogs on their feet. They had got the man down, and were vociferating with oaths not to be repeated here. "Gi'me a lick with his clogs! Punce him well! Shut up his tater trap for him! Put him in bread basket! Fettle his mug with high clog!" Before Jabez and his companion could prevent it, a heavy thud followed by a groan told of a brutal kick. The two only dashed among them in time to arrest the other clogs, already on the backward swing for force, and save the prostrate man by turning the fury of the savages on themselves. The cowardly brutes, however, stood little chance against sobriety and skill, backed by the muscular frame of Jabez and the Herculean one of Travis, even though they carried weapons of offence on their feet and plied them vigorously, and before a droning watchman hove in sight to spring his rattle for assistance, they were overmastered or put to the rout. Most thankful was Jabez for the impulse which had directed their steps that way, when, on raising the fallen man, the light of an adjacent oil lamp projecting from the wall fell on his blood-stained face and revealed Tom Hume, who had been drawn into that unusually disorderly neighbourhood by like curiosity with their own, and had been set upon without provocation. He walked with pain, and they supported his steps to the infirmary, not finding Mr. Hurtley, on whom they called at home. But so fertile had that evening been of serious injuries, he was some time before he could obtain attention. 13 far more urgent cases had preceded his. At length his head and cut lips were plastered up, a reviving draught administered, and after some examination of bruises and poking and pressing of his body, 3 of his ribs were pronounced broken. His defenders were disposed to smile at the surgeon, when, besides an embrocation for bruises, he prescribed a succession of oatmeal poultices applied internally. In other words, a cushion of as much oatmeal porridge as the patient could consume, to press the crushed ribs gently into position. It was, however, not much of a laughing matter to Tom Hume, or to loving Bess, who looked aghast at this deplorable termination of a day's jollity. Nor was there a trace of mirth on the face of Jabez, when, at parting with Ben Travis on the Mosley Street doorstep, he gripped, more in pain than pleasure, the big hand extended so cordially. It was after midnight, but from the open windows of the still-lighted drawing-room the thin, quick ears of Jabez had caught the sound of Augusta's melodious voice, blending with that of Lawrence Aspinall in a popular duet, although the notes of the latter were neither so clear nor so steady as they might have been. The pallor on her foster-son's face Bess attributed to tender-hearted sympathy for her injured husband, but Jabez hurried away from her oppressive thanks to the solitude of his own chamber, where he could bury his face in his quivering hands and unseen wrestle with emotions of which she had no conception. Never had he known a day so checkered. The same sun which had looked down at noontide on the triumph of his amateur brush had beamed on Augusta Ashton's conscious cheeks as she accepted his rival's familiar act of gallantry without so much as a frown. The evening had made a man of him, lifted him into a new sphere, brought him, so to speak, nearer to his divinity, within the radius of her smiles, the music of her voice. She had put her small white hand within his and blessed him with a word or two of shy recognition. But Lawrence Aspinall had again come like a cloud between him and his sunbeam. Her sweetest smiles, her softest tones, were for the intruder. Her arm had rested willingly on his, a voice ablent with his in sentimental song, and darkness once more shut out hope from Jabez. Common sense might have taught me that my love was folly, presumption, madness, he argued with himself, that the heiress of a wealthy man would not stoop to her father's blue-coat apprentice. But oh, he groaned, I had hoped to raise myself step by step nearer to her level, to make myself worthy of her as a man, if I had not riches to lay at her feet. She is young, and what might I not accomplish with industry ere she came of age? But how? He tore his neckcloth off and cast it from him, stripped off coat and vest and flung them aside, as though they held his passionate folly, and he had done with it, then sank into a chair, the very impersonation of listless hopelessness. He had gone through all this struggle once before, and thought he had overcome his weakness, but at the touch of the enchanter's wand love had blazed up afresh and was not to be smothered. His reverie was broken into by the tread of many feet on the staircase below, and the murmur of voices calling one to another. The hall door shut with a clang, and then a light foot came tripping up the stair alone, and from heart and lips dropped unconsciously the soft refrain of that too well-known duet. She, too, was carrying to her chamber memories of the night, and bearing the burden lightly. He listened until her door closed upon step and song. Then, as if its echoes pierced his soul, he set his teeth and clenched his outstretched hands in mute agony. There was more than hopeless love in this, there was jealousy also. Then he murmured half-audibly, if he were only worthy of her, I could bear it better, but to see her cast her heart at the feet of one who will trample on it is beyond mortal endurance. He started to his feet. A bright thought irradiated his face. Coward that I am, I'm quitting the battle without striking a blow. I am myself unworthy of Augusta if I surrender her to a heartless profligate without an effort to save her. Faint heart never won fair lady. Women have stooped lower and lowly men have looked higher ere now. I am making way, but I must make money too if I would look above me. Father and mother took on me with favour, and why not the daughter? She may learn the worthlessness of the fine gentleman in time. Courage, Jabez, work with a will, do your duty, miss no opportunity, and the gold and the goddess may both be yours in the end, and honestly won. He sprang into bed, fresher and lighter than he had been all day, the prayer of that other Jabez rising from his heart with the fervour of old times. Chapter 34. Birds of a Feather. The Palace Inn on the north side of Market Street Lane was the last relic of that cramped thoroughfare to disappear at the bidding of improvement, possibly because its many eyes and bald, dark red brick face looked out on a space so much beyond the 21 yards assigned by Act of Parliament to the regenerated street that the Improvement Committee had no powers to meddle with it, for surely its historic associations were not sufficient to protect it. Prince Charles Edward had been hospitably lodged and entertained beneath its roof by its owner, Mr. Dickinson, long ere it became an inn. He had harangued his devoted followers from the stone plateau of its double flight of steps, with his hand perchance on its smooth rail of unornamented iron, but in isolated dignity rather than palatial pretensions lay its chief safeguard. Be that as it may, 14 or 15 years elapsed between the first act of demolition for widening at the shop of a Mr. Maund, and that last feat of narrowing which blocked up and darkened history, as represented by the palace, with common stone warehouses for everyday merchandise. Alas, Clio and all her sister muses must succumb when Mammon is on the march. But Mammon had only got his first foot in the street on that Thursday morning in July, which blushed at the doings of the coronation night, and the Palace Inn yet held its head high, as beseemed its historic state. The open space in front was enlivened by the newly painted London stagecoach, the Lord Nelson, the fresh scarlet coats of coachmen and guards, the assembling of passengers and luggage, the shouting and swearing of half-awake hostlers and porters, the grumbling of the first-comers, shivering in the raw air at the unpunctuality of the stage, the excuses of the booking clerk, the self-gratulations of the last arrival that he was in time, the dragging of trunks and portmanteaus onto the top, the thrusting of bags and boxes into the boot, the harnessing of snorting steeds, the horsing of the vehicle, the scrambling of the outsiders to the top by the ladder and wheel, the self-satisfied settlement of the insides in the places they had boot for, the crushing and thrusting of friends with last messages and parting words, the crack of the whip, the sound of the bugle, the prancing of horses, the rattle of wheels, and the dashing off up Market Street Lane of the gallant four in hand amid the hurrahs of excited spectators. Every morning witnessed a somewhat similar scene of bustle and excitement at 5 o'clock when the London coach started, but every morning did not see Jabez mounted on the box seat with the coachman, nor did every morning see the coach an hour behind time, or the driver's face quite so red, or the spectators so heavy-eyed, or so much handing up of horns and glasses to the passengers to be returned empty, or leave Mr. Ashton standing there when the Lord Nelson had bowled away. That coronation day had much to answer for. When Tom Hume should have risen at 4 o'clock to return home, his bruised limbs were so stiff and sore that the soldier, who had borne the fatigue of many a campaign, who had bivouacked on the battlefield after a forced march, and been ready with the sum for the day's duties, had to confess himself fettled by Lancashire clogs, and unable to stir. There was no alternative but to acquaint Mr. Ashton. The mill could not be left without a manager. After the night's unwonted dissipation, Mr. Ashton slept heavily, and was with difficulty aroused. When once he comprehended the state of affairs, he was on the alert. "It's a bad business," said he to his wife as he dressed in haste. "There is nothing so bad but it might be worse," was her consolatory reply. "Never bewail a loss till you have done your best to repair it. Can you not send Mr. Clegg to Whaley Bridge for a few days?" "My dear, your counsel is invaluable, but I fear there is not time to catch the coach. It is 20 minutes past 4 now." "It is sure to be late this morning, and Jabez will catch it, if it is to be caught," was her quick rejoinder. Bess had already awakened Jabez, and he, fully dressed, met Mr. Ashton at his bedroom door with, "Can I be of any service, sir?" A prompt commentary on Mrs. Ashton's declaration, a few necessaries hastily crammed into a carpet-bag, a bowl of milk and a crust of bread as hastily swallowed, and Jabez, accompanied by Mr. Ashton, was on his way to the palace coach office, confident they were in time, not having heard the guard's bugle or met the coach. There was, however, barely time to claim for Mr. Clegg the place already booked for Mr. Hume. Mrs. Hume's seat was forfeited, and for him to take his seat before they were off in a canter, and Mr. Ashton's business mind was relieved. As the manufacturer, satisfied that the mill hands at Whaley Bridge would not be left altogether to their own devices, stood within a short distance of the high steps looking after the vanishing coach, a party of roisterers came swaggering out of the inn, hallooing with all their tipsy might. One in advance of the rest, observing an elderly gentleman below, pointed him out to his companions as fair game, and leaning over the rail to steady himself, cried out, "Halloo, old fogey, are you a Tory or a Radical? Damn me, take your hat off before gentlemen," and suiting the action to the word, extended a riding whip he carried, and jerked Mr. Ashton's hat off into the dust, whereupon his worthy comrades set up a loud guffaw in admiration of the feat. Naturally, Mr. Ashton, his brief reverie disturbed, stooped to pick up the fallen beaver, and making due allowance for the unwonted occasion, turned to remonstrate good-humouredly with an excited stranger, who had evidently drunk the king's health too frequently. It was not with more surprise than annoyance that he recognised 4 of the hilarious party in the doorway, and on the steps of the inn, which had apparently been open the night through. Not one of the four was in a condition to recognise him, although two of them, John Walmsley and Lawrence Aspinall, had supped overnight at his own table, although the third, Kit Townley, had good reason for remembrance, and Ned Barrett was anything but a stranger. Loud laughter hailed the fall of the hat. A second attempt to uncover the obstinate old fogey was made, but dexterously avoided by Mr. Ashton, in his absolute astonishment, stepping backward beyond range. "Young gentleman, do you know whom you are insulting?" There was another laughing chorus. Aspinall almost toppled over the rail as he leaned forward, impotently striking out with his whip. "I protest the old rad's damnably like the lovely Augustus' snuffy old dad," drawled out he in a sort of tipsy wisdom. "Just so," appended Walmsley, mimicking the old gentleman's peculiarity. Mr. Ashton, though a reasonably temperate man himself, was not so greatly shocked at these young carousers as we might be. Long usage blunts sensibilities. It was a glorious distinction to be a three-bottle man. The inability to drink a solitary bottle of wine at a sitting was a sort of disqualification for good fellowship, and it was considered a fine thing for a boy of 7 to toss off a glass like a man. So the genial old gentleman was inclined to allow some latitude for the special occasion. But they had touched him on a tender point. The light mention of his darling daughter's name roused his blood. "John Walmsley," he cried angrily, looking up, "what brings you, a married man, with these young rakes at this hour of the morning? Pray, what brought you here, old fogey?" hiccoughed Aspinall, answering for the other. One of the ostlers, Bob the ex-groom, squeezed between the rollicking fellows to whisper in the ear of Lawrence. He was impatiently thrust back with an elbow. "Tch! Don't believe it. Old Snuff and Tuppenny's fast asleep in bed, sure as your gun. I know better, I say you." But old Snuff and Tuppenny had turned on his heel, too wise to enter into contention with a set of inebriated boobies, though not proof against the disrespectful epithets of Lawrence or the derisive laughter of his boon companions. His irritation half emptied his snuff-box before he got home. So often he tapped smartly on its golden lid, and so often his ringer and thumb travelled between it and his nose with a touch of ruminant displeasure. Neither he nor Mrs. Ashton was disposed to overlook the fact that Kit Townley and Ned Barrett, scapegraces by repute, were of the party, nor that Augustus' name had been used in their midst. "Birds of a feather flock together," said the lady, "and if Mr. Aspinall's son associates with that reckless and dishonest Kit Townley, he is a very unfit friend for John Walmsley, and still worse for our dear Augusta." "Just so, for a dashing blade with a handsome face who sports a uniform, talks poetry and sings sentimental songs is just the fellow to take a silly girl's fancy before she's old enough to think. I know I regret I ever brought him here," said Mr. Ashton seriously, as Augusta came in the room to breakfast, entering at the door behind her mother's back. "Well, William," observed Mrs. Ashton loftily, her hand on the china coffee-pot, "you can imagine my annoyance when John and Mr. Lawrence walked in arm last night, after the liberty he had taken in the morning kissing his hands to our daughter from the public procession in the face of all our friends, as if Augusta had been a flaunting barmaid. I was most indignant." Augusta said good morning and took her seat with a heightened colour. Such a construction of the gallant officer's salute had not occurred to her, and native delicacy took alarm. Mrs. Ashton continued to pour out her thoughts along with the coffee. It was fit Augusta should know her sentiments on this head. It would have been a breach of hospitality to resent it in front of our friends, and not good policy either, but I shall put a stop to his visits henceforth." "Oh, mamma!" exclaimed Augusta, dropping her hands, "you cannot mean that." "Yes, my dear, I do. If Mr. Aspinall has depraved associates, he must be depraved himself, and I am sure my daughter," she drew herself up proudly, "would not choose her friends from those of Christopher Townley." Augusta's colour suffered no decrease. She paused as she was taking her dry toast from the silver rack, and half hesitatingly remonstrated. "Of course I should not wish to associate with Mr. Townley's friends, but papa may be mistaken. I do not think Mr. Aspinall would mix with them. People meet and mingle at coach offices who are strangers." "Just so, my dear, but," interposed her father. "Why, mamma," the persistent young lady went on, "no more perfect gentleman enters our doors than Mr. Lawrence Aspinall. His manners are most refined. Then he talks enchantingly and sings divinely, and," this she thought conclusive, "is he not intimate with Charlotte and John?" "Just so," quickly answered Mr. Ashton, glancing across the table at his attentive wife, "and all the worse for Charlotte and John. I shall have a word with them on the subject. I called in Marsden Square on my way home, and found Charlotte with red eyes. John had not been home all night," and Mr. Ashton battered the top of an egg whilst delivering what he regarded as a crushing argument. Breakfast and the discussion were unusually prolonged, the only impression left on the young lady's romantic, impressible, and inexperienced mind being that her parents were unaccountably harsh to her and unjust to Mr. Lawrence. In her eyes the beau ideal of a man, such a figure and such a face, could only enshrine divinity, and, if he was a little wild, so were all heroes at his age. Let not the inexperienced young girl be overmuch condemned for this. The opinion generally prevailed in her day. She had heard the sentiment expressed in farces on the stage, in society at home and elsewhere. Even her own father's hospitality trended in the same direction. Mrs. Ashton was a woman of her word. The door in Mosley Street was closed against Mr. Lawrence Aspinall, and James was incorruptible. But the teachings of Miss Bohanna's library being that love was far-seeing and parents were blind, it followed that Miss Augusta, who would have resented any supposition of wilful disobedience or intentional disrespect towards the good father and mother she loved so dearly, met the fascinating gentleman, always by chance, either at her cousin's in Marsden Square or in her walks abroad, and scented billet-doux came and went between the leaves of 4-volume romances which Cicely carried to and from the library. One of these fell into Mrs. Ashton's hands, when, finding her advice contemned, she took measures to check this premature and clandestine love-making, as she thought, effectually. Chapter 35. At Carr Cottage. Tom Hume was most anxious to get back to Ellybridge and the mill, and motherly Bess was equally uneasy to return to her poor little Sime, afraid lest he should tax his grandfather's strength overmuch, or meet with some fresh accident. Yet more than a week elapsed before her husband was fit to travel, and in the interim Mr. Ashton had himself gone thither to ascertain how the new substitute filled the post. He was still at Carr Cottage when the Lord Nelson stopped at the end of the avenue, and Jabez, with fragile Sime mounted on his shoulder, trotted down to the gate to welcome Bess and her invalid home. They had travelled inside, but Jack Loudon McAdam had not yet been appointed surveyor of roads, and Tom Hume had suffered severely from the jolting of the coach. Bess clasped her child tenderly, and held him up for his father's kiss, but she put him down to waddle on before them. He could not run, whilst she and Jabez helped the injured corporal to ascend the steep incline. Old Simon, who seemed to have got a new lease of life from the invigorating country air and occupation, had already breakfasted, and was in the bean field gathering the first ripe pods for a dinner of beans and bacon. "Tom, lad," said he, as he entered the house-place, and saw his son-in-law's pale face against the blue and white check cover of the armchair. "Why, thy face is as white as a clout. Thou'll noan be fit to work for one while. Thou's nobbut fit for sit under t' sycamore tree and look at flowers, and watch me put garden in fettle." "Just so," said Mr. Ashton, bringing his pleasant face in at the door. "I think Mr. Clegg will have to do duty for you a while longer, and don't distress yourself about it, Mr. Hume, for I fancy a little fresh air will do him no harm this hot weather. He's been overworking lately, and does not look too brisk." "You are very kind, sir," responded Jabez, "but I trust a few days' rest will set Mr. Hume on his feet again." He said nothing of himself, but Tom Hume had received unsuspected internal injuries, and many weeks went by before he was stout as before. Weeks pregnant with fate for Jabez, and not Jabez alone. Factory hours were long, but the summer days were longer, and he was glad after work was over to ramble away through the valley of the Goyt, following the winding of the stream, or over the larch-clad hills above Taxel, whence he would return with the rising moon, bringing pockets full of the crisp brown fir cones for Syme to play with. In the pine woods, alone with nature, he could give vent to his emotions, or indulge in meditation at his will. Mr. Ashton, however, found him other occupation for his spare hours. The landlord of the White Hart, bearing in mind that Mr. Clegg had come under his roof first as a travelling artist, had expatiated to Mr. Ashton with much pathos on the deplorable condition of the inn sign, not without sundry broad hints that Mr. Clegg's temporary residence on the spot was a glorious opportunity not to be neglected. Mr. Ashton had smiled, said "just so," taking a pinch from the immense snuff-box lying on the bar-parlour chimney-piece, then falling back upon his own, had gone away and forgot the dingy sign altogether, until another hint from his tenant refreshed his memory. As he stood at the inn door waiting for the Manchester coach, an upward sly glance of the jolly hosts caused him to say to the young man by his side, "Do you think you could manage to paint a new sign for the White Hart to oblige Chapman and me?" Jabez hesitated, not from unwillingness. "I'm afraid, sir, to attempt. It's not in my line, and—" "Oh, you can do it well enough. Remember the banner. I've no materials here, sir, else, if that is all, you shall have them in a day or two." In a few days an easel, a new signboard, and colours were sent by the Manchester and Buxton carrier, and Jabez set to work, to the especial wonder and admiration of little Syme, who delighted to stand by his side, and grew rebellious when bedtime was announced. Jabez was, however, but an untaught artist, and his painting hours were few. The couchant heart was rubbed in and wiped out over and over again, before he was satisfied even with the outline, but then it grew in fair proportion under his brush, until he felt there was something in him beyond the region of tapes and braces. The graceful animal, resplendent in golden collar and chain, looked mildly out from the easel in the parlour nearest to the passage, used when the family was there as an eating room, and little Syme gravely reported to his elders it only wanted gas and tea and kye, when the inmates of Carr Cottage were startled by the arrival of unexpected visitors. It was the second week in August. The air was heavy with the perfume of clove, carnations, honeysuckle, mignonette, lavender, musk, and mint. Golden sunflower and crimson hollyhock were in their glory. Bees and wasps hovered over balsams and china asters, or hid themselves in the blue Canterbury bells or the amber nectary of the stately white lily. Fruits were ripe for the gatherer. Grain was falling under the sickle. Bess, in a fair white muslin cap, a large check apron over her dark chocolate and white print gown, her blue bedgown days were over, was moving quietly about the house-place, preparing their early breakfast, no longer restricted to oatmeal porridge. Tom, looking warm but clean and neat as loving hands could make him, leaned back in his soft armchair and watched her with well-satisfied eyes. Little Simon was already in the garden with his grandfather, helping to gather raspberries and currants for preserving. The tall oak-case clock struck 7, and then, true to time, the guard's bugle announced the coming of the coach from Manchester. Instinctively Bess went to the door, as was her wont when the coach came in. She uttered an exclamation of surprise. Tom, I declare, t' coach is stopping at our gate. Happen there's a parcel or summat for our Jabez. And off she set past the kitchen window and the farmyard Gothic doorway, and down the avenue, with the light foot of a younger woman. Before she reached the avenue gate, the stuffy vehicle had yielded up 3 ladies and 2 bandboxes, and the guard, having unlocked the capacious boot, a kind of closet at the back, dragged thence, with much superfluous puffing and straining, 2 hair trunks of moderate dimensions. Yes, there stood Mrs. Ashton, grandly calm, bright-haired Augusta, tall, slim, and, it must be added, unamiably silent, and Ellen Chadwick, whose black eyes had an absolute glow of expectancy in their depths. Bess put up her hand in amazement. Mrs. Ashton, madam, you han taken us unawares, and there isn't a bit of flesh meat in th' house, and butcher's cart wunna be round again till Saturday. But I'm downright glad to see you, and young ladies." She dropped a respectful curtsy. "And all looking so well. I were afraid you were not coming this summer." "Never mind the butcher's meat, Mrs. Hume. Having come to Carr, we must do as Carr does. I do not doubt we shall fare very well," said the stately lady reassuringly. "I trust we shall find your good husband free from pain, and Mr. Clegg and your family in health." Bess thanked Mrs. Ashton for her kind inquiries, but somehow she boggled over the Mr. Clegg. She was proud enough of his advancement, but to her he was still Jabez, and he did not seek to be otherwise. There was a difficulty about the luggage, no men being about. By this time old Simon was nearly down the hill, little Simon following at his heels, his face, hands, and pinafore stained with fruit. "I run for Joe," cried crippled Simon, as Bess tried the weight of her trunk, and Ellen interposed. Run indeed! It was the very travesty of a run. "Well, you see as how most folk are out in fields cutting oats. Feyther and me can carry one of 'em atween us. They're no one so heavy," said Tom, who had followed in the wake of Bess. Mrs. Ashton would not hear of it. Just then little Simon came back with Joe, his most particular friend, to whom he was chief patron, a drivelling idiot, a man in frame, a child in heart and brain. He was a pitiable object, the scoff of the rabble, but he had sense enough to know his protectors. At the instance of the 4-year-old child, he shouldered the box with a vacant chuckle, and Simon, loaded with oval pasteboard bandbox, half as big as himself, waddled after him as fast as his deformity would permit. Before the travellers could reach the top of the avenue, Jabez Clegg was with them, the other trunk upon his shoulder. He had heard at the White Hart of their arrival, and had almost sacrificed the dignity of his position in his desire to run. There were more greetings, accompanied by a cordial shaking of hands, and Bess and Simon looked on with pleasure, not unmixed with pain, that the foundling they had adopted and reared had mounted far above their heads, albeit in rising he had drawn them up too. He breakfasted not with them in the house-place, but with the newcomers in the parlour, and Bess herself waited upon them, Meg, her little maid, being off in the harvest field, gleaning for a bedridden mother. She heard him conversing freely, if deferentially, with the lofty Mrs. Ashton on topics, and in a language her provincial tongue could never compass. She saw him turn to answer the arch sallies of Miss Ashton, and the quieter observations of Miss Chadwick, and noted that the dark eyes of the latter kindled when he spoke, and her cheeks had a warmer glow, as if they caught their hue from the flushed face of Jabez. Breakfast over, little Simon sat on the doorstep to share his with Crazy Joe, whilst Ellen and Augusta retired to unpack. Mrs. Ashton graciously accepted They escorted Mr. Clegg to the mill, and they trod the avenue and the high road side by side, discussing business matters, her dignity losing no whit by the companionship. Mrs. Ashton was one of those who could lift up without stooping. Clouds never lingered on Augusta's face. She had been transported thither, as she said, with no more ceremony than a bale of twist, but she put off her displeasure with her travelling bonnet, and danced into the kitchen airily as a sylph, to help Bess out of the quandary caused by their advent. "I am afraid our arrival has been very inauspicious," Augusta said, "but I can assure you I was not consulted, and am not to blame." She had certainly not been consulted. Blame was another matter. "And now, what can I do for you, Mrs. Hume?" Augusta tucked up the sleeves of her peach-coloured gingham dress, borrowed a linen apron from Bess, who confessed to being rather heavy-oned at paste, and soon the matron was at ease respecting pies and tarts and custards. Simon Clegg brought in a dish of trout fresh from the stream. The larder supplied savoury ham and eggs. The garden furnished peas, so Mrs. Ashton was not far wrong. It was but a spurt on Augusta's part. Her tender, impressionable heart had melted at Mrs. Hume's first look of dismay, but the impulse over, there was no more tucking up of sleeves or handling of paste-pins. Fortunately for their digestion, Ellen Chadwick had no less skill, since, quiet as she was, she seemed to lack an outlet for superabundant energy, and obtrusively restless, help Bess, she hardly knew how or how much. Augusta wandered about cottage and garden, or sat for hours under the shade of the great sycamore tree, singing low-voiced plaintive ditties, feeling herself the most ill-used and wretched being in existence, separated from her adorable lover, and the more she brooded, the more discontented and melancholy she became. It was all very real and very much to be deplored. No knife cut so keenly at the heartstrings as the sharp edge of a first love turned in upon itself, and Augusta was as much in love as ever was maiden of 17. Mrs. Ashton went daily to the mill, but a casual remark of Mrs. Hume's on Miss Ashton's moping and melancholy aroused the attention of the energetic mother, and she did her best to counteract morbid fancies with long sharp walks in the early morning, extending on one occasion as far as Shawcross Hall, where she astonished her relatives by an informal visit, and a repetition of the dose in the evening, when Mr. Clegg made one of the party, thus unconsciously adding fuel to the fires which, unknown to her, consumed alike her niece and her warehouse man. At the end of 10 days, Mrs. Ashton returned to Manchester, leaving the girls behind. She had extorted a promise from Augusta that she would not write to Mr. Lawrence Aspinall, and relied on that promise being faithfully kept. Moreover, after some debate with herself, as they walked from the mill together on the last afternoon of her stay, she committed her daughter and niece to Jabez Clegg's care. "You are a very young man for so important a charge," she said, "but you are as steady as old time, and of your integrity and fidelity we have had many proofs. Miss Ashton's health demands a prolonged stay on this breezy hillside, but I fear she feels it dull after Manchester. If you will endeavour to amuse her when you see her drooping, I shall consider myself your debtor, sir, and should anything unusual attract your notice, I depend on your calling our attention to it." "I feel honoured by the trust you repose in me, madam," replied he, a grave consciousness of his own danger stirring at his heart. "You may depend on my watchfulness over Miss Ashton and her cousin. But of any danger to Miss Ashton beyond that arising from a sensitively delicate frame, which might need the sudden summons of Dr. Hull to allay the fears of parents anxious for their only child, he had no suspicion or perception. He had no more clue to Mrs. Ashton's hidden meaning than she to his secret emotions. It had been wiser to have been more explicit. Without that charge, he might have made it a point of honour, if not of duty, to hold aloof from the young ladies, lest he should be obtrusive. As it was, the more he pondered, the more he became satisfied that it was only a delicate way of giving sanction to a companionship he might otherwise have regarded as presumptuous. Accordingly, he constituted himself their cavalier after business hours, fulfilling to the letter his instructions to endeavour to amuse Augusta whenever he found her drooping. Well rewarded if he could win back a smile or a peal of the rippling laughter he had heard so oft in her schoolgirl days. His attentions to Miss Chadwick were tinctured with the profoundest respect, but there was no effort to entertain or be agreeable. On the contrary, it was Miss Chadwick who kept the light shafts of her cousin's wit within bounds, when they were likely to wound, as they did sometimes. The White Hart, to Syme's disquiet, would have suffered long from dearth of herbage, had not thunderous clouds emptied their reservoirs amongst the hills, until brooks became rivers and roads almost impassable. Then Jabez resumed his brush. Syme clapped his thin little hands with delight, whilst the sedate young lady of 24 and the bewitching damsel of sweet 17 varied the monotony of piano, book, or embroidery frame with an occasional criticism of his work. It was a time fraught with intoxicating delight, but of terrible temptation to Jabez. The frequent fits of languor, which bowed Augusta down like a drooping lily, made her only more dangerously dear to him, and it needed all his strength to remember that she was his master's daughter, and confided to his care. If he now thought of Lawrence Aspinall and his fascination, it was only as a butterflied beau, for whom no sensible maiden could entertain a permanent liking, not even when, turning back one forenoon for something in the closet which he had forgotten, he found her in tears on the low ledge of the open window at the foot of the staircase. "Good heavens, Miss Ashton, what is the matter? Are you ill? Is anything troubling you?" "Nothing," sobbed she, the clear drops falling faster. "Nothing? Oh, Miss Ashton, this cannot be for nothing," and he sat down on the window ledge beside her, not daring so much as to touch her hand. His own were in such a quiver. "Miss Ashton, Augusta, you told me your troubles when you were a schoolgirl. Am I less worthy your confidence now? Can I do anything to serve you? I would lay my life down to save you from pain." And the earnest tenderness of his voice spoke volumes. She had subdued her emotion. Gathering herself up with the reflex of her mother's stateliness, she said haughtily, "It is nothing, sir, I am better," and swept past him up the staircase, leaving him to set his teeth and turn away with clenched hands, alike exasperated at his own loss of self-command and grieved for her grief. On the narrow landing which ran parallel with the staircase like a balcony, Augusta found her cousin Ellen, with one hand on her side, leaning against the chamber doorpost as if for support, with closed eyes and pale lips. She had been overcome by the heat, so she said.